The Kansas heat shimmered like liquid glass across the endless prairie, distorting the horizon until earth and sky seemed to meld into one punishing furnace. Margaret O'Brien pressed a damp cloth to her forehead and surveyed her kingdom, a one-room schoolhouse that served as Cedar Falls' educational institution, town meeting hall, and her entire world. At 26, Maggie had been teaching frontier children for 4 years, ever since arriving from Boston with idealistic dreams of bringing civilization to the expanding West. Those dreams had been tempered by harsh reality, but her commitment to education remained as fierce as the Kansas wind that rattled the schoolhouse's simple plank walls. "Miss O'Brien, Tommy Henderson's pulling Sarah's braids again," announced 8-year-old Emma Watson, her voice carrying the authority of someone who took her role as teacher's assistant very seriously. Maggie looked across the room where 16 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old attempted to focus on their lessons despite the oppressive heat. The Henderson boy, predictably, was indeed tormenting his neighbor with the time-honored tradition of romantic harassment disguised as mischief. "Thomas," Maggie said firmly, "please direct that energy toward your arithmetic problems. Sarah, move to the desk beside the window where you'll have better light for reading." The simple intervention restored order, but Maggie couldn't help noting how the heat affected everyone's concentration. The schoolhouse's single window provided minimal ventilation, and the water barrel in the corner was nearly empty despite her careful rationing. Cedar Falls existed primarily to serve the surrounding ranches and farms, a collection of buildings that optimistically called itself a town while consisting of little more than a general store, a saloon, a church that doubled as a doctor's office, and her schoolhouse. The railroad had promised to extend service to their area, but those promises seemed as distant as rain in the current drought. Miss O'Brien called out 12-year-old Jack Murphy, one of her oldest and most promising students. "My pa says I need to quit school after harvest to help with the ranch full-time. Says book learning won't help me brand cattle or mend fences." Maggie's heart sank, though she kept her expression neutral. Jack was one of her brightest pupils, capable of pursuing higher education if given the opportunity. But frontier families often viewed schooling as a luxury they couldn't afford when survival demanded every available hand. "Learning serves many purposes, Jack," she replied carefully. "Understanding mathematics helps with calculating feed costs and managing herd sizes. Reading helps you stay informed about cattle prices and new ranching techniques. Education isn't separate from practical life, it enhances it." Jack nodded thoughtfully, but Maggie knew her arguments might not overcome the immediate pressures his family faced. Too many of her students left school prematurely, their potential unrealized because frontier economics valued strong backs over educated minds. The afternoon lesson focused on geography, with Maggie using her precious collection of maps to show the children how their small corner of Kansas fit into the larger world. She'd purchased the maps with her own limited funds, along with most of the school supplies, since the town council's budget for education consisted mainly of good intentions and occasional promises. "Now, who can tell me the capital of Colorado?" Maggie asked, pointing to the territory west of their location. "Denver," several voices called out enthusiastically. "Excellent. And why might it be important for Kansas farmers to know about Colorado?" Emma Watson raised her hand eagerly. "Because that's where some of our cattle go on drives, and understanding trade routes helps ranchers make better business decisions." Maggie smiled with genuine pride. Emma possessed a kind of quick intelligence that could take her far beyond Cedar Falls if properly nurtured. But like all her female students, Emma faced limited options in a society that viewed women's education as preparation for managing households rather than pursuing independent careers. As the afternoon wore on, Maggie noticed a cloud of dust approaching from the east. In frontier country, travelers were common enough, but something about this lone rider caught her attention. Perhaps it was the deliberate pace of his approach, or the way he seemed to study the schoolhouse before dismounting near the front steps. "Children, please continue reading Chapter 7 while I step outside for a moment," Maggie instructed, smoothing her simple brown dress and checking that her auburn hair remained properly pinned beneath its modest covering. The man who stood beside the tired bay gelding was perhaps 30 years old, with sun-weathered features and clothes that marked him as another drifting cowboy seeking work or passing through to destinations unknown. His hat was dusty from long riding, his shirt showed the sweat stains of hard travel, and his boots were worn to comfortable functionality. But something in his bearing suggested education and refinement beneath the practical frontier appearance. His posture was straight without being stiff, his movements economical but graceful, and when he touched his hat brim in greeting, the gesture carried genuine courtesy rather than casual acknowledgement. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that might have originated in the South or perhaps the educated East. "I'm wondering if you might spare some water for my horse and myself. We've been riding since dawn, and this heat's been brutal." Maggie hesitated, mentally calculating the water remaining in her barrel against the afternoon's needs and the uncertain prospect of the next delivery. But frontier hospitality demanded assistance to travelers, and the man's obvious exhaustion made refusal impossible. "Of course," she replied, leading him toward the pump behind the schoolhouse. "There's a trough here for your horse, and I can offer you fresh water as well." As the grateful animal drank deeply, Maggie worked the pump handle to fill a tin cup for the stranger. She noticed his hands as he accepted the water. Though callous from riding, they showed signs of education in their clean nails and careful movements. "Teaching school out here must be challenging work," the man observed, nodding toward the building where children's voices carried to the open window. "Challenging but rewarding," Maggie replied automatically, then found herself expanding on the theme despite her usual caution with strangers. Education is civilization's foundation, especially in places like this where children might otherwise grow up without exposure to literature, science, or broader understanding of the world. The stranger's eyes lit with genuine interest. "You sound like someone who's given considerable thought to education's role on the frontier." "I have," Maggie admitted, surprised by her willingness to discuss her passion with a complete stranger. Too many people view schooling as unnecessary luxury when survival requires immediate attention. But educated citizens make better decisions about everything from farming techniques to civic participation. "And what challenges do you face in providing that education?" Maggie found herself describing the constant struggles of frontier teaching: inadequate supplies, irregular attendance, families who viewed education as secondary to immediate economic needs, and a community that supported the idea of schooling in principle but struggled to fund in practice. "Books are particularly difficult to obtain," she continued, warming to her subject. "I have perhaps 30 volumes for 16 students ranging from beginning readers to young adults ready for advanced studies. Mathematics texts are especially scarce, and science education remains largely theoretical since I lack equipment for proper demonstrations." The stranger listened with an attention that encouraged further conversation. Most people in Cedar Falls either took the school for granted or viewed it as a necessary burden on the town's limited resources. This man seemed genuinely interested in understanding the complexities of frontier education. "What would help most?" he asked simply. Maggie laughed, but without humor. "More resources in this community can provide. Proper textbooks, basic scientific equipment, maps and globes that aren't hand-drawn, regular supplies of paper and ink, and perhaps most importantly, community recognition that education represents investment in their children's futures rather than time stolen from immediate productivity." "And personally, what keeps you here when eastern cities would offer better working conditions and reliable salaries?" The question touched something deep in Maggie's heart, the core motivation that sustained her through difficult days and discouraging setbacks. "These children deserve the same opportunities as city students," she said firmly. "Intelligence and curiosity aren't limited to urban areas. Some of my students possess remarkable potential that could benefit themselves and society if properly developed." She gestured toward the schoolhouse, where her pupils continued their lessons. "Emma Watson could become a teacher or writer if given advanced education. Jack Murphy has mathematical abilities that could serve engineering or business. Little Sarah Henderson creates stories that show genuine literary talent, but they'll probably become farmers and ranchers like their parents." "Perhaps," Maggie acknowledged, "but even farmers and ranchers benefit from education. And some of these children might choose different paths if they understand what options exist beyond the immediate horizon." The stranger nodded thoughtfully, his expression suggesting he understood the deeper implications of her work. Education as expansion of possibilities rather than preparation for predetermined roles. "Exactly," Maggie felt a flush of pleasure at being understood so clearly. Few people in Cedar Falls grasped that concept, viewing education primarily as basic literacy and arithmetic needed for practical tasks. As the stranger prepared to continue his journey, refreshed and clearly grateful for the water and conversation, Maggie found herself reluctant to see him leave. Their discussion had reminded her why she'd chosen frontier teaching despite its hardships and limitations. "Thank you for the water and the conversation," he said, adjusting his saddle before mounting. "It's rare to meet someone so passionate about their calling." "Travel safely," Maggie replied, watching as he rode toward the western horizon. "And thank you for listening." Sometimes it helps to discuss these matters with someone who understands their importance. As dust settled in the stranger's wake, Maggie returned to her classroom where 16 young minds waited to be shaped and challenged and inspired toward futures they couldn't yet imagine. The encounter had energized her sense of purpose, reminding her that education's value transcended immediate circumstances. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the dusty traveler had been more than he appeared, that their conversation had meant something beyond casual frontier hospitality. Something in his questions and responses suggested familiarity with educational issues that went beyond polite interest. "Miss O'Brien," Emma Watson called out. "Who was that man?" He seemed different from the usual travelers. Maggie smiled, settling back into her teaching rhythm. "Just someone passing through, Emma. Now, let's continue with our geography lesson. I want to tell you about the universities in the eastern states and how education can take you anywhere you choose to go." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the prairie, Maggie threw herself into teaching with renewed energy, inspired by the stranger's genuine interest in her work and his understanding of education's transformative power. She had no way of knowing that their brief encounter would soon change everything about her life and her dreams for frontier education. The mysterious traveler's visit lingered in Maggie's thoughts long after the dust of his departure had settled. That evening, as she prepared lessons for the following day by lamplight, she found herself replaying their conversation and wondering about the man who'd shown such genuine interest in frontier education. Daniel. He'd finally offered that name as he prepared to leave, had asked questions that revealed uncommon understanding of educational challenges. His observations about learning as expansion of possibilities suggested familiarity with progressive educational theories that most frontier residents had never encountered. "You're being fanciful," Maggie scolded herself, organizing tomorrow's arithmetic problems by candlelight. He was just a polite traveler, making conversation. But she couldn't dismiss the way Daniel had listened to her concerns about inadequate resources and community attitudes towards schooling. Most people's eyes glazed over when she discussed educational philosophy, yet he'd encouraged her to elaborate on ideas she rarely had opportunity to share. The next morning brought new challenges that demanded her complete attention. Young Timothy Carson arrived at school with black eye and split lip, the result of his father's drinking and volatile temper. Maggie carefully cleaned his injuries while the other students settled into their morning routine, her heart aching for the bright 8-year-old who carried burdens no child should bear. "Can you tell me what happened, Timothy?" she asked gently, applying salve to his bruised face. "Fell off my horse," Timothy replied with the rehearsed lie children learn to protect abusive parents. "Wasn't watching where I was going." Maggie knew better, but also understood the limits of her authority in family matters. The best she could do was provide Timothy with a safe environment during school hours and hope that education might eventually offer him alternatives to the cycle of violence that trapped too many frontier families. "Well, you must be more careful," she said, playing along with his fiction while making mental notes to watch for signs of escalating abuse. "Now, let's see how you're progressing with your reading." Timothy's literacy skills had improved dramatically since the school year began, providing him with escape into stories that transported him beyond his difficult home situation. Maggie had learned to recognize which students use education as refuge from harsh realities, and she tailored her teaching to nurture their growing confidence. As the morning progressed, Maggie noticed Jack Murphy's empty desk with growing concern. The boy hadn't attended school for 3 days, and she suspected his father had already pulled him out for full-time ranch work despite harvest being weeks away. During the lunch break, while her students ate outside under the limited shade of a scraggly cottonwood tree, Maggie walked to Murphy Ranch to check on Jack's situation. The 2-mile journey across open prairie gave her time to practice arguments she hoped might convince his parents to reconsider their decision. She found Mrs. Murphy hanging laundry behind their modest farmhouse, her weathered face showing the strain of frontier life and too many difficult pregnancies. The woman's expression grew defensive when she spotted Maggie approaching. "If you're here about Jack, Miss O'Brien, we've already decided. The boy's needed at home, and there's no more to discuss." "Mrs. Murphy, I understand the pressures your family faces." Maggie began carefully. "But Jack has exceptional mathematical abilities that could serve him well in business or engineering if properly developed, with just 2 more years of education. 2 more years of sitting in a classroom while his father breaks his back trying to make this place profitable?" Mrs. Murphy's voice carried the edge of desperation that Maggie had learned to recognize in frontier women pushed beyond their limits. "Jack's 14 years old, Miss O'Brien. Old enough to do a man's work and help support his family. Education is an investment in his future earning potential," Maggie pressed. "With proper schooling, Jack could find opportunities that pay better than ranch work." "And what opportunities would those be?" Mrs. Murphy demanded. "There's no railroad here, no businesses except what serves the local farmers. Jack's future is here on this land, and he needs to learn ranching, not poetry and philosophy." Maggie recognized the futility of arguing with someone who viewed education as luxury rather than necessity. Mrs. Murphy wasn't wrong about the limited local opportunities, but she couldn't see beyond immediate circumstances to imagine alternatives that education might create. "If circumstances change," Maggie said finally, "please remember that Jack is always welcome back at school." Walking back across the prairie, Maggie felt the familiar frustration of watching potential squandered by economic necessity. Jack Murphy possessed the kind of analytical mind that could have thrived in higher education, but frontier pragmatism had claimed another promising student. The afternoon brought a visit from 3 members of the town council, their serious expressions warning Maggie that more bad news was coming. Mayor Henderson, storekeeper Williams, and rancher Mackenzie settled uncomfortably into chairs designed for children, their presence filling the small schoolhouse with adult concerns. "Miss O'Brien," Mayor Henderson began carefully, "we need to discuss the school's financial situation." Maggie's stomach clenched with familiar dread. These conversations always led to requests for her to accept reduced salary or threats to close the school entirely due to budget constraints. "The town's tax revenues have been lower than expected this year," Henderson continued. "The drought has hurt everyone's finances, and several families have moved on to more promising areas. We're having difficulty meeting our obligations." "What are you asking of me?" Maggie replied, though she already knew the answer. "We can only afford to pay half your agreed salary for the remainder of the year," storekeeper Williams said bluntly. "And we'll need you to provide more of your own supplies rather than expecting the town to furnish them." Maggie calculated quickly in her head. Half salary would barely cover her modest room and board, leaving nothing for books, paper, ink, or the 100 small necessities that frontier teaching required. She was already spending most of her earnings on school supplies, and further reductions would make her position financially impossible. "The alternative," Rancher Mackenzie added, "is closing the school until the town's financial situation improves. Maybe next year or the year after, depending on railroad developments and crop prices." "You'd rather have no school than pay a teacher's minimal salary?" Maggie asked, her voice sharp with indignation. "We'd rather find a solution that works for everyone," Mayor Henderson replied diplomatically. "Perhaps you could take in additional students from outlying ranches, charge modest tuition to supplement your income." Maggie knew that most ranch families couldn't afford tuition payments any more than the town could afford teacher salaries. The suggestion revealed how little the council understood about the economic realities their constituents faced. "I need time to consider your proposal," she said finally, though there was little to consider. "Accept impossible working conditions or watch the school close entirely." After the council members left, Maggie sat alone in her classroom and allowed herself a few minutes of despair. For years of building educational programs, of nurturing young minds and fighting for the importance of learning, seemed about to crumble due to financial pressures beyond her control. But as she watched the sun set over the endless prairie, Maggie felt her determination resurge. These children deserved better than abandonment when times got difficult. If she had to accept reduced salary and provide more supplies from her own pocket, she'd find a way to make it work. That evening, she wrote letters to educational supply companies in Kansas City and Chicago, hoping to find sources for discounted materials. She also began composing a letter to her aunt in Boston, exploring the possibility of small loans that might help sustain the school through its current crisis. As she sealed the letters for tomorrow's mail delivery, Maggie thought again of her conversation with mysterious Daniel. His understanding of educational challenges had reminded her why frontier teaching mattered, why the struggle was worth continuing despite discouraging setbacks. She had no way of knowing that Daniel was at that very moment writing letters of his own to architects, educational suppliers, and contractors who specialized in building schools, or that her simple act of sharing water with a thirsty traveler had set in motion events that would soon transform not only her personal circumstances, but the entire future of education in Cedar Falls. Sometimes, Maggie reflected as she prepared for bed, the most significant moments in life appeared deceptively ordinary. A stranger asking for water, a brief conversation about teaching, an exchange of ideas between people who might never meet again. But the seeds of understanding, once planted, had a way of growing in directions that neither giver nor receiver could predict or control. October brought the first frost of the Kansas prairie, painting the grasslands in shades of gold and amber that reminded Maggie why she'd fallen in love with frontier landscapes. But the beauty couldn't mask her growing concerns about the school's precarious situation and her own financial struggles. True to their threat, the town council had reduced her salary to barely survival levels. Maggie now spent almost every spare moment taking in sewing and mending work to supplement her income, her evenings filled with darning socks and repairing torn garments by lamplight rather than preparing the elaborate lesson plan she preferred. The reduced supplies were even more challenging than the pay cut. Maggie had exhausted her personal savings purchasing basic necessities like chalk, paper, and ink. Her students now shared textbooks that were already inadequate for the range of ages and abilities in her classroom, and she'd taken creating learning materials from whatever scraps she could find or afford. Miss O'Brien. Emma Watson announced one morning, little Jenny Cooper's family moved away in the night. Her pa said they're heading for Oklahoma Territory, where land's still available for homesteading. Maggie's heart sank as she marked another empty desk in her mental roll call. The Coopers were the third family to leave Cedar Falls since the beginning of the school year, taking their children and their modest contributions to the community's tax base with them. With only 12 students remaining, the school's survival became even more questionable. Educational funding depended partly on enrollment numbers, and falling attendance gave the town council additional justification for further budget cuts or complete closure. "We'll miss Jenny," Maggie said simply, though privately she worried about the 6-year-old's educational future in a territory where schools remained scarce and teachers scarcer still. The morning brought news that Jack Murphy had indeed been permanently withdrawn from school to work his family's ranch full-time. Maggie had hoped his parents might reconsider once harvest pressures eased, but Mrs. Murphy's brief note made their decision final. Jack won't be returned to school. The note read in careful handwriting that revealed its author's own limited education. He's needed at home and feels he's learned enough bookwork for ranch life. Thank you for your efforts. Maggie crumpled the note with frustration before smoothing it out and filing it carefully. Each law student represented not just reduced enrollment, but unrealized potential, dreams deferred or abandoned entirely due to economic necessity. During lunch break, while her remaining students played outside, Maggie walked to the general store to purchase supplies with coins carefully counted from her diminished earnings. Storekeeper Williams looked uncomfortable as she selected modest quantities of basic necessities. "Miss O'Brien," he said as she counted out payment for chalk and writing paper, "I hate to mention this, but your account here is running higher than we prefer. Perhaps you could settle some of the outstanding balance before adding new charges." Maggie felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized her financial situation had become public knowledge. In small frontier communities, everyone's business eventually became common information, but she'd hoped to maintain some privacy about her struggles. "Of course," she replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "I'll settle the account this week." But as she walked back to the schoolhouse, Maggie knew that paying her store debt would exhaust the remainder of her savings and leave her completely dependent on her inadequate salary and sporadic sewing income. The afternoon brought a visit from Mrs. Henderson, the mayor's wife and one of Cedar Falls' most influential women. Her presence usually signaled some community crisis requiring educational input, but today her expression carried personal rather than official concern. "Margaret, dear," Mrs. Henderson began, using the motherly tone she adopted when dispensing unwanted advice, "I'm worried about you. You're looking quite thin, and everyone knows you're struggling financially." Maggie straightened her shoulders, determined not to appear as desperate as she felt. "I'm managing adequately, Mrs. Henderson. The school's needs come first, and I'm willing to make personal sacrifices to ensure my students receive proper education." "But that's exactly what concerns me," Mrs. Henderson continued. "You're sacrificing your health and future for a situation that may not be sustainable. Have you considered that it might be time to seek a teaching position elsewhere, somewhere with better financial prospects?" The suggestion hit Maggie like a physical blow. Leave Cedar Falls? Abandon her students to seek easier circumstances in established communities with adequate funding and resources? These children need education just as much as students in wealthier districts, Maggie replied firmly. More, perhaps, since they have fewer alternative sources of learning and cultural exposure. Of course they do, dear, but you can't single-handedly solve the frontier's educational problems. Perhaps it's time to be practical about your own welfare. Mrs. Henderson's well-meaning advice echoed Maggie's own doubts during her darkest moments. Was she being foolishly stubborn in clinging to an impossible situation? Could her efforts make a genuine difference? Or was she merely postponing the inevitable closure of Cedar Falls School? That evening, as Maggie darned socks by candlelight to save lamp oil, she allowed herself to seriously consider leaving. Eastern cities offered teaching positions with adequate salaries, proper supplies, and supported communities that valued education. She could afford decent housing, nutritious food, and the cultural opportunities she'd given up for frontier service. But then she thought of Timothy Carson, whose bruises had faded but whose hunger for learning remained constant, of Emma Watson, whose quick mind deserved challenges that could prepare her for opportunities beyond traditional women's roles, of the remaining students who looked to her not just for academic instruction, but for proof that education mattered enough for someone to fight for it. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Reverend Miller, whose circuit included Cedar Falls among several small communities. The elderly preacher's arrival usually signaled someone's need for spiritual counsel or his quarterly evaluation of the school's moral instruction. "Miss O'Brien," Reverend Miller said, settling his spare frame into one of the student chairs, "I've been hearing concerns about the school situation. If you're here to suggest that financial difficulties are divine judgment on secular education, Reverend, I'm not interested in that conversation." Maggie replied with a directness that frontier life had taught her. Reverend Miller chuckled, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Actually, I'm here to offer support. I've been corresponding with educational missions in Kansas City, and they may be able to provide some assistance with supplies and materials." Maggie's heart leaped with unexpected hope. What kind of assistance? Books primarily, along with basic education materials that missionary organizations provide to frontier schools. It wouldn't solve all your problems, but it might help stretch your resources further. The offer represented more than material aid. It was recognition that her work mattered enough for others to support it. Maggie felt tears threaten as she realized how desperately she needed such validation. "I would be extremely grateful for any help you can provide," she said. "There is one condition," Reverend Miller continued. "The mission organizations prefer to work with schools that demonstrate long-term stability. They want assurance that their investment in materials won't be wasted if the school closes after one difficult year." Maggie understood the implication. To qualify for aid, she needed to prove her commitment to staying in Cedar Falls regardless of current difficulties. It was exactly the kind of commitment that Mrs. Henderson had advised her against making. "I can provide that assurance," Maggie said without hesitation. "This school will continue operating as long as there are children to teach, and I have strength to teach them." As Reverend Miller left to write his recommendations, Maggie felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead remained difficult, but she was no longer walking entirely alone. Support existed for those stubborn enough to persist through temporary setbacks. That afternoon, She threw herself into teaching with energy that surprised her students and herself. They worked on advanced mathematics problems that challenged the older students while the younger ones practiced basic arithmetic. They read poetry aloud, discussed geography with the fervor of explorers planning expeditions, and tackled writing assignments that encouraged them to imagine futures beyond the immediate horizon. "Miss O'Brien," Emma Watson observed as they cleaned the classroom at day's end, "you seem different today. Happier." Maggie smiled, realizing that hope was indeed a transformative force. "I received some encouraging news today, Emma. Sometimes when we think we're facing our challenges alone, we discover that others share our goals and want to help us achieve them." As October's golden light faded into the deep purple of prairie twilight, Maggie felt grateful for her decision to stay and fight for frontier education. She had no way of knowing that Daniel, the mysterious traveler she'd helped months earlier, was at that very moment finalizing plans that would soon provide more support than she'd ever dared to imagine. Sometimes persistence in the face of overwhelming odds was rewarded in ways that restored faith in both human nature and the power of education to transform lives. November's bitter wind rattled the schoolhouse windows as Maggie led her remaining 11 students through their morning recitation. 3 more families had left Cedar Falls since October, seeking opportunities in regions where drought hadn't devastated crops and optimism about railroad development hadn't yet been crushed by repeated disappointments. The promised aid from missionary organizations had arrived, a precious shipment of books, slates, and writing materials that felt like Christmas morning to Maggie and her students. But even those welcome supplies couldn't address the fundamental problem of a community too poor to adequately support education. Miss O'Brien called out Billy Patterson, one of her youngest students. "There's a whole bunch of wagons coming up the road. Looks like they're heading right for us." Maggie looked up from the geography lesson she'd been conducting with their new maps, noting the excitement in Billy's voice. Travelers were common enough, but multiple wagons suggested something more significant than routine passage through Cedar Falls. Through the schoolhouse window, she could see an impressive caravan approaching. For freight wagons loaded with building materials, 2 passenger carriages, and a dozen riders who move with the purposeful organization of men engaged in serious business. "Children, please continue reading Chapter 5 while I step outside to see what this is about," Maggie instructed, though her own curiosity was now thoroughly aroused. As the procession halted near the schoolhouse, Maggie felt her breath catch in recognition. The man dismounting from the lead carriage was unmistakably Daniel, the dusty traveler who'd asked for water 3 months earlier. But this Daniel bore little resemblance to the humble cowboy she remembered. His clothes were expensively tailored, his horse was a magnificent thoroughbred, and the men with him showed the deference of employees towards someone who clearly commanded both wealth and authority. Even more striking were the rolled papers he carried, architectural drawings that suggested building plans of considerable scope. "Good morning, Miss O'Brien," Daniel said, approaching with a smile that mixed warmth with obvious nervousness. "I trust you remember me, though I suspect my appearance has changed somewhat since our last meeting." Maggie stared at him, her mind reeling as she tried to reconcile the modest traveler she'd helped with this obviously prosperous stranger. "Daniel, yes, but I don't understand. Who are you really?" "Daniel Morrison," he replied, extending his hand in formal greeting. "Owner of Morrison Railroad Development Company, and someone who owes you a debt of gratitude that I'm finally in position to repay." The name hit Maggie like a physical blow. Daniel Morrison was famous throughout the railroad industry, a young millionaire whose company specialized in bringing rail service to frontier communities while investing in the infrastructure necessary to support expanding settlements. "You lied to me," Maggie whispered, feeling foolish for her naive acceptance of his humble disguise. "I gave you incomplete information," Daniel corrected gently. "But everything else about our conversation was genuine. Your passion for education, your understanding of frontier challenges, your commitment to these children, that discussion shaped decisions I've been making ever since." He gestured toward the wagons and workers who waited for his instructions. "I've come back to Cedar Falls because our conversation convinced me that education deserves the same investment and support that railroads and businesses receive on the frontier." Maggie looked past him at the obvious wealth and resources he commanded, feeling overwhelmed by the implications of his presence. "What are you proposing?" Daniel unrolled his architectural drawings, Spreading them on the schoolhouse steps where morning sunlight illuminated detailed plans for a building that took Maggie's breath away. The proposed school was magnificent. Multiple classrooms, a library, laboratory space for scientific instruction, and living quarters for teachers. A proper educational facility for Cedar Falls, Daniel explained, his voice gaining enthusiasm as he outlined his vision. Fully funded by Morrison Railroad Development, with endowment funds to ensure permanent operation regardless of local economic fluctuations. The scope of what he was offering made Maggie dizzy. Everything she dreamed of for a frontier education, adequate resources, proper facilities, financial security that would allow her focus entirely on teaching rather than constantly fighting for survival. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why would you invest so much in one small community school?" Daniel's expression grew serious as he met her eyes directly. "Because you taught me something important about the relationship between immediate necessity and long-term vision. You showed me that education isn't luxury to be delayed until communities become prosperous. It's investment that helps create prosperity." He described how their conversation had influenced his business philosophy, leading him to research educational needs in frontier communities served by his railroad development projects. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that infrastructure investment should include schools alongside depots and commercial buildings. "Cedar Falls will be your pilot program?" Maggie asked, studying the detailed architectural plans with growing amazement. "Cedar Falls will be our pilot program," Daniel corrected. "I'm hoping you'll consider accepting the position of principal for the new school, with authority to hire additional teachers and develop curriculum that serves as a model for other frontier communities." The offer was beyond anything Maggie had imagined possible. Financial security, adequate resources, the opportunity to create educational programs that could influence frontier schooling throughout the region. It was everything she'd worked toward, presented by the mysterious traveler she'd helped with simple frontier hospitality. But even as excitement surged through her, Maggie felt a nagging concern about accepting charity disguised as opportunity. "This seems awfully generous for someone you met once during a chance encounter." Daniel's smile was rueful but genuine. "Margaret, may I be completely honest with you?" The use of her full name, spoken with obvious affection, made Maggie's heart skip in ways she wasn't prepared to examine. "Please. I didn't come to Cedar Falls by accident 3 months ago. I'd been traveling through Kansas, researching communities that might benefit from railroad development, when I heard about a schoolteacher who was single-handedly maintaining education in a town that couldn't afford to pay her adequate salary." Daniel explained how reports of her dedication had reached educational circles in Kansas City, where his railroad company maintained offices. Her reputation for persistence despite impossible circumstances had intrigued him enough to arrange a chance encounter to evaluate her work firsthand. "So the water, the conversation, the whole thing was calculated?" Maggie asked, feeling hurt and manipulated by the revelation of his deception. "The circumstances were calculated," Daniel admitted, "but my response to what I found was completely genuine. I expected to meet a dedicated teacher worthy of support. I didn't expect to encounter someone whose passion and integrity would fundamentally change how I view the relationship between business success and social responsibility." He gestured toward his waiting workers and equipment. "This investment isn't charity, Margaret. It's partnership with someone whose vision I want to help implement on a scale that could benefit thousands of frontier children." Maggie studied his face, trying to separate her personal feelings about his deception from a professional evaluation of his proposal. The opportunity he offered could transform not just her own circumstances, but educational possibilities for entire communities across the expanding frontier. "There's something else," Daniel continued, his voice growing softer and more personal. "Something I didn't plan for and couldn't have predicted when I set out to evaluate a teacher's work." From his coat pocket, he produced a small velvet box that made Maggie's heart race with anticipation and terror. "I fell in love with a woman who shared her precious water with a stranger who fought for her students' futures despite impossible odds, who reminded me that real worth isn't measured by profit margins or stock portfolios." Daniel opened the box to reveal a diamond ring that caught the morning sunlight like captured starfire. "Margaret O'Brien, will you marry me?" Not because I can provide financial security for your educational dreams, but because I can't imagine building a future without the woman who taught me what courage and integrity actually look like. As Maggie stared at the ring that represented both her professional dreams and personal feelings she'd barely allowed herself to acknowledge, she realized that Daniel Morrison had indeed kept his promise to repay her kindness. But the true gift wasn't money or buildings or security. It was a recognition that her work mattered enough for someone to risk everything in supporting it. The decision she faced would determine not just her own future, but the educational possibilities for countless frontier children who deserve the same opportunities as students in established eastern cities. Maggie stared at the ring for a long moment, her mind racing to the implications of Daniel's proposal. Inside the schoolhouse, she could hear her students continuing their lessons, their voices a reminder of the responsibilities that had shaped every decision she'd made for the past 4 years. "Daniel," she said slowly, "I need to understand something important. Is this proposal, both the marriage and the school project, contingent on my answer to either one?" Daniel's expression grew serious as he recognized the depth of her concern. "The school project moves forward regardless of your personal decision about marriage. Cedar Falls needs better educational facilities, and I'm committed to providing them whether you accept my proposal or not. And the position of principal? That offer stands on its professional merits," Daniel replied firmly. "You're the most qualified person I've encountered for developing frontier education programs. My personal feelings don't change that assessment." Maggie felt relief flood through her at his answer. The separation of professional opportunity from personal relationship was crucial to her sense of integrity and independence. However, Daniel continued with a slight smile, "I should mention that the project would be much more enjoyable and meaningful if undertaken with someone I love rather than merely someone I professionally respect." Despite her confusion about the complexities he'd introduced into her life, Maggie found herself laughing at his careful distinction. "You realize this is extremely unconventional? A business proposal, marriage proposal, and career offer all delivered simultaneously. Frontier life tends toward unconventional solutions," Daniel observed. "Traditional courtship procedures seem inadequate when dealing with someone who spent 4 years proving that conventional limitations don't apply to her." Maggie looked again at the architectural drawings spread on the schoolhouse steps, then at the ring that represented possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. "May I ask my students what they think about the school plans?" "Of course," Daniel replied, though his expression suggested he found her request unexpected. Maggie called her 11 remaining students outside, noting their wide-eyed amazement at the wagons, workers, and obvious wealth surrounding their humble schoolhouse. She spread the architectural drawings where everyone could see them clearly. "Children, Mr. Morrison is proposing to build a new school for Cedar Falls," she explained. "I'd like your opinions about these plans before making any decisions." The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Emma Watson studied the library space with obvious longing, while Timothy Carson focused on the laboratory facilities that would allow hands-on scientific learning. Even the youngest students understood that the proposed building represented educational opportunities far beyond what their current facility could provide. "Miss O'Brien," Emma said thoughtfully, "this would mean other children could come back to school, wouldn't it? Families that left might return if they knew education was guaranteed here." "It's possible," Maggie agreed, though she was touched by Emma's immediate concern for classmates who'd been forced to abandon their studies. "And you'd stay to teach in the new school?" asked Billy Patterson, voicing the question that concerned them all. Maggie looked at Daniel, who waited patiently for her decision without pressure or persuasion. His proposal offered everything she'd worked toward: financial security, adequate resources, the opportunity to prove that frontier education could equal any program in established eastern cities. But more than professional opportunity, Daniel offered partnership with someone who understood her passion and wanted to help her achieve goals that seemed impossible when faced alone. "Yes," she said, speaking first to her students but keeping her eyes on Daniel. "I'll stay to teach in the new school. And Mr. Morrison," she continued, accepting the ring he offered with hands that trembled only slightly, "I'll be honored to accept your marriage proposal as well." The cheer that erupted from her students was immediately echoed by Daniel's workers, who'd apparently been awaiting the outcome of negotiations that would determine their immediate employment prospects. "When do we start building?" Emma Watson asked with a practical concern that frontier children learned early. Daniel consulted the papers he'd been carrying. Construction begins immediately, with completion planned for spring term. We'll also need to recruit additional teachers, since proper education requires specialized instruction in mathematics, sciences, and literature. Over the following weeks, Cedar Falls was transformed by activity that hadn't been seen since the community's founding. Daniel's construction crews worked with efficiency that impressed even skeptical locals, while his educational consultants arrived from Kansas City to help design curriculum and select materials. Most remarkably, families that had left Cedar Falls began returning as word spread about the new school and guaranteed educational opportunities. The promise of stable, well-funded education proved a powerful draw for parents who wanted their children to have advantages they'd been denied. Maggie found herself balancing wedding preparations with curriculum development, her days filled with decisions about everything from mathematics textbooks to lace patterns for her dress. Daniel's patient support through both professional and personal planning convinced her that she'd chosen a true partner rather than merely a generous benefactor. No regrets about giving up the itinerant educator life. Daniel asked one evening as they reviewed applications from teachers interested in joining their faculty. Maggie looked around the new school building that was rapidly taking shape, its multiple classrooms and modern facilities representing dreams she'd barely dared to articulate. Only that it took so long to happen, she replied. And no concerns about marrying someone who deceived you about his identity? Maggie considered the question seriously. Daniel's initial deception had hurt, but his subsequent honesty and commitment to her professional goals had demonstrated the sincerity of his character. I'm marrying someone who recognized the value of frontier education before it was profitable or fashionable, she said finally. Someone who was willing to invest in other people's dreams because he understood their importance. The circumstances of how we met matter less than what we discovered about each other since then. Their wedding took place in the completed school building on a bright April morning, with the entire Cedar Falls community in attendance, along with educational leaders from throughout Kansas who'd come to witness the dedication of the territory's most advanced frontier school. As Maggie and Daniel exchanged vows in a library that would soon house thousands of books, she reflected on the journey that had brought them together. A simple act of frontier hospitality had grown into love, partnership, and educational opportunities that would benefit generations of frontier children. I promise to support your dreams, Daniel said as part of his personal vows, and to remember always that the most important investments are made in human potential rather than financial returns. I promise to remember, Maggie replied, that the best teaching happens when we believe in possibilities that others can't yet see. As they sealed their promises with a kiss, the assembled crowd erupted in celebration that echoed across the prairie. Cedar Falls had gained not just a new school, but renewed hope for the future that education could create. 6 months later, as Maggie stood before 3 classrooms filled with 60 students ranging from 6 to 16 years old, she marveled at how quickly educational opportunity had transformed a struggling frontier community. The new teachers she'd recruited brought expertise in subjects she'd never been able to offer, while the modern facilities allowed hands-on learning that engaged students in ways traditional recitation never could. Mrs. Morrison, Emma Watson called out, using the title that still felt new and wonderful, Jenny Cooper's family came back. Her father said they heard about the school and decided Cedar Falls was worth another chance. Maggie smiled, noting how educational opportunity had become Cedar Falls' most attractive feature for families seeking places to build their futures. Daniel's investment had proven that frontier communities could support institutions equal to anything found in established cities when given adequate resources and committed leadership. As afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that faced the endless Kansas prairie, Maggie felt profound gratitude for the mysterious traveler who'd asked for water and returned with possibilities beyond her wildest dreams. Sometimes the most significant changes in life began with simple acts of kindness that planted seeds in exactly the right soil. The frontier schoolteacher and the railroad millionaire had built something together that neither could have achieved alone, an educational legacy that would prepare countless children for futures limited only by their own determination and dreams.